Welcome once again to Along the Rio Grande. I'm George Torok, and today we'll be spending some time with Mr. Leon Metz, very well-known El Paso historian, who has a new guidebook out. It's a guide to the city of El Paso and the El Paso area. It's called El Paso, Guided Through Time. Leon, welcome to Along the Rio Grande.
George, I'm honored to be here. I thank you for inviting me.
Now, you've spent a long time studying the history of this area. You've worked with many different topics. How did you get involved in writing El Paso history? How did that come about?
You know, it's a funny thing. I like reading, and in particular, I read fiction, or not fiction, I read nonfiction. And I didn't know anything about El Paso's history, and I came to El Paso and with the Air Force here. And I'm working at Standard Oil, and there's a lady who has a book page in the El Paso Times, Mrs. Liebson, Paula Liebson. And I always read the book reviews, and one day she said, I'm looking for people who could review books. And I thought, gee, I like to write them, or read them, so why not? So I sent her a little note, and she asked me if I'd review Westerns. Didn't matter to me, I would have reviewed anything. So I went downtown, and I rented a manual typewriter for $5 a month. I stopped at the public library and picked up a book on how to type, and I began writing reviews about Western books, really without knowing what I'm doing. And one day I said to her, you know, Mrs. Liebson, I see where there was a lot of gunfighters in El Paso. John Wesley Hardin was here, John Selman was here, Billy the Kid came through. I said, I'd like to write a book with a chapter on each one of these characters. I thought really gunfighters was all that history was in those days, Western history. So she suggested I go up and see Doc Sonicson at the university, who I had never heard of. But he was a very well-known Western writer. So I make an appointment, and I go in to see him, and I sit across the desk from him. I can see it now. And I said, I'm going to write these books, and John Selman, who killed John Wesley Hardin, will be my first chapter, and Mrs. Liebson thinks I should have talked to you. And he says, where are you going to get your information? I said, well, kind of surprised me. I said, you go to the library, you check out the books on these characters. I figured everything had already been written on. You get the book, then you rewrite it, and there's your chapter. At any rate, he thought I was nuts, and I thought he was a stuffed shirt, and that was the end of it. But a couple of weeks later, the El Paso County Historical Society had a meeting at the downtown public library. I wasn't a member, but it was free and it was open to the public. It was on a night I didn't have to work. So I went down. I don't remember the program, but in leaving, I bumped into Doc Sonicson. He says, how you doing on your Selman research? And I said, since talking to you, I just forgot about it. He said, a few of us going for coffee, why don't you come along? And I said, no thanks, and we shook hands, and I went on home. And the next day, he wrote me a letter, and he said, John Selman's granddaughter was in El Paso in 1930, and she was looking for her grandfather's grave in Concordia Cemetery, and he said, I don't know if she found it or not. I don't know if she's even still alive, because we're talking now 1950, and he knew of her in 1930. And she doesn't live in El Paso if she's still alive, but assuming she's alive, won't you see if you can find her and see what she has to say about her grandfather? I found out at that point I had very good detective instincts. Took me about 3 months, but I tracked her down in Salinas, California, and I wrote her the kind of letter I hate to get from other writers. I said, I'm doing this book on El Paso gunfighters, and your grandfather, John Selman's going to be a chapter, and please tell me everything you know about her.
Do you have any information?
Yeah,
sure.
I didn't know enough about him to ask her questions. I just said, tell me what you know. Well, she wrote me 7 pages. Most of it was inaccurate, but I didn't know it at the time, and she wasn't lying. She just didn't know that much history about her father. And I took it up to Sonicson, and I laid it down, and I said, all right, well, I do now. He began telling me, do this, do that. Well, then I began writing, and I'm a terrible writer also. I did not excel in high school in writing compositions and so on. And Sonicson looked up at me one day and he said, Leon, you can say done went, but you can't write done went and expect to get away with it. I thought done went was good lingo. My brother done went to the store. Well, anyhow, so he taught me to write, and one day I said to Doc, you know, I've got a problem here, Doc. Selman's just going to be a chapter, but look how many pages I've already got on him, and I'm not through yet. And Sonicson said, well, why don't you make a book out of Selman? So that was my first book, and I've been sort of blowing and going ever since.
Now, we've done a lot of work since then. What number book is this? How many
This
have we
is number
produced?
16.
Number 16.
And the first one was in 1967. It was published in 1967.
Great. So you have quite a breadth of knowledge of El Paso history. You know a lot of the different periods, a lot of the different areas. You've done some work on the missions. You've done some work on gunfighters, the Wild West.
Right.
How did the idea for a guidebook develop? Where did that come from?
I had done so many things. My first 4 or 5 books were gunfighter books. And then I got a little sick of people who killed other people, and I thought, I want to do something different. So I decided to do a border book, a history of the Mexican border. Took me 15 years to write that thing. I thought I would die before it was finished. But at any rate, it came about, and then I did other books, one of Turning Points of El Paso, sort of the big events that had happened, and a few other things. But when I came to the border, it occurred to me that, or not to the border, I beg your pardon, when I came to the El Paso Guided Through History, it occurred to me that I've done these gunfighter books, I've done so much El Paso history and related history of the area, and I talk about a lot of these things, but even I, to a large extent, don't know exactly where this, that, or the other event took place. So I decided to write what I called a historic guide. It was the publisher who changed the title on me. Says I was going to call it the Historic Guide to El Paso. They called it El Paso Guided Through Time, and that's a better title.
So these are basically historic sites or historic areas of the city.
Right.
We're not talking about hotels or restaurants or that type of material.
Sometimes we are.
We mentioned
Yes, we
some in
mention
context.
hotels, we'll mention stories. We don't mention everything, and in context. But so much of your history, for instance, you can write a book on gunfighters or some other aspect of the history, and you touch on various areas, but when people go downtown, they don't know where it is. When I go downtown, it is, I don't know where it is. So I decided to put it all together and talk about so many things that are significant also, but they don't make it into history books for whatever reason.
And I'm assuming a lot of these places are not marked, right?
Oh,
These are
practically
places that
none of them are
practically
marked.
none of them are.
In fact, El Paso is one of these cities that has very few historical markers. I think that's changing now. I look within the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see a lot of historical markers in El Paso, but they're not here now.
But in the meantime, the book will guide you through some of these places,
To a
correct?
large extent, it is primarily a walking tour downtown. And there I even hit the, I'll mention the street number as it is today, and that helped. However, when I got into South El Paso and into Chihuahuita and into Sunset Heights and other places, making it a walking tour at that point wasn't quite so easy. The distances were much longer because downtown you got a core of so many things happening, you go from one thing to another. When you're in Sunset Heights, you go 1 block here or 2 blocks, and so it's more of a, let's say, a driving tour than anything else.
And does just about every area of the city have something of interest or something of significance to point out?
El Paso is one of these marvelous towns that has 400 years of some of the most colorful, diverse history you'll find anywhere on the planet, and it's all over town. For instance, downtown you think of as primarily gunfighter and Wild West and Mexican Revolution, but you also have a Chinese core down there with a very fascinating history. In the lower valley, of course, you have your missions. In Sunset Heights, you have your attractive homes in a different location. So there's so much to see in El Paso. So much happened here.
The basic layout of El Paso has changed over time as well, right? The river moves, and some of these
river
places
moves.
are in different areas.
At one time, for instance, when the book starts, a river runs through where Paisano is right now. And but downtown is a core. When you think of El Paso, particularly with its history, you've got to begin with downtown because that's where it all started.
Do we have areas here or sites here that are unique, one of a kind, something very different for people to see? What kinds of things would be of interest to someone visiting El Paso for the first time?
Well, I think the plaza, for one thing. The plaza used to be right in front of where the Plaza Theater is right now. The Plaza Theater, of course, is defunct too. But you've got a lot. El Paso's got some great architecture downtown. I am not an architectural authority, so I point out in the book that I don't, that if you're an architect, you want to know a lot of detail on this type
Or
of
technical
architecture,
information.
technical information. You're not going to get it here. You're going to get the historical aspects, but with the architectural styles, you're going to have to go somewhere else. Although sometimes I do touch on that.
What are some of the buildings that really catch your attention downtown?
Well, you've got the old Wells Fargo building there at the corner of El Paso and El Paso and San Antonio Street. You have, in looking back and forth, you look at buildings that, I mean, as you wander in and out of the street or of downtown, you see these buildings, if you stop and look at them. I mean, take the Bassett Tower, and I forget when it was built, around 1924, but that's a marvelous building. And the more you look at it and go inside and look at it, it's different. But the architecture of downtown, and it's diverse also. Right. It's not, everything is not just one particular style. Unfortunately, what is gone is what we once had so much of it, and that's the adobe buildings. Because El Paso, downtown at least, well, in most parts of town, began as adobe buildings originally.
What are some of the older buildings that we have in the downtown area? How far back do we have structures? Roughly back to about 1881.
That's when the railroads arrived. When the railroads arrived, they brought in wood, they brought in brick, they brought in architects, they brought in builders, and so at that point, in 1881, El Paso began moving away from adobe buildings into the modern buildings, which we're seeing today.
Okay. Let's talk about some of the different areas. You mentioned Chihuahuita, the Segundo Barrio. What kinds of things are in Chihuahuita? What's the history of that area? Why is it important?
Chihuahuita, in many respects, is frankly the oldest part of El Paso. We talk about a man by the name of Ponce de Leon, who came from Juarez into El Paso in 1827, and Ponce is generally considered the founder of El Paso. But there was another man, a Frenchman, a priest who had left the priesthood, who moved into Chihuahuita. Montestruc, I think, if I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the name correctly. But the house in which he lived in was torn down only about 30, 40, 50 years ago. It was here for a long time. But Chihuahuita, when you think of Chihuahuita, you think of Chihuahua. People who came out of Chihuahua, and so the area of town in which they lived, you call Little Chihuahua or Chihuahuita. You have streets down there like Durango, people who lived in Durango or whatever. You get that Durango Street, Leon. I'm not sure where Leon came from, if it came from the town or if it came from somebody who owned the area. But Chihuahuita is, even today, kind of off the beaten path. Most of us have heard about it, but we haven't been there, even though if we go down Santa Fe Street and cross the bridge, we walk right past it. But it's kind of out of the way. It sits off to its side quietly. It's not, it doesn't attract your attention. It's just there.
And this is an area that drew a lot of people, especially during the Mexican Revolution and afterwards.
Yes, definitely. The refugees came out of Mexico, well, by the tens and the hundreds and altogether into the thousands. There are pictures of them, men, women, and children. The government didn't know what to do with them for a while, and they put them behind barbed wire at Fort Bliss and called them prisoners of war. And when the fighting died down in Mexico, why some of them went back to Mexico, but most of them stayed to go on and build the character and the heritage of the El Paso Southwest. So many Hispanic people in El Paso today can trace their ancestors back, or their descendants, their lineage back to the Mexican Revolution.
And the Segundo Barrio, moving over a little bit.
Segundo Barrio is, the town originally was divided into 4 districts, and the second ward of the Segundo Barrio, as they refer to it, is simply a boating area, and it also was in the lower end of town. The Segundo Barrio primarily also had the Chinese, and the Chinese, of course, people ask me where was the Chinatown.
Now, why would there be Chinese people in El Paso? How would they get here?
Okay, the Chinese originally tried to get into the country. Now, the government, our government, the federal government, made it illegal for Chinese to enter the country. We had a Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, which says you aren't allowed because Chinese, well, the government thought of them as an inferior people.
Sure.
So Anyhow, many of them would slip into to British Columbia and come down into Washington, which is why you got such a Chinese area in San Francisco and Seattle and so on. The government shut that down. So then they slipped down and they came in on Baja, California, and they came up through San Diego. And the government closed that off. Then they came into Guaymas, Mexico. Mexico now, there was a railroad from Juarez all the way to Mexico City, the Mexican Central, and they would come over to the railroad, and then they would come up to Juarez, and El Paso then became the Chinese smuggling center of the United States as they funneled across here. And there were hundreds of them in El Paso. We, meaning El Paso, we have a Chinese cemetery in Concordia. It's a part of Concordia. I don't know of another Chinese cemetery in the United States. Now there has to be some. I mean, I don't know that much about Chinese cemeteries, but particularly in San Francisco and perhaps Seattle. But in El Paso, we have something unique there. And the Chinese made great contributions, but they funneled in and they just sort of blended in with the people who lived here, and that's why it's difficult to define a certain Chinatown.
So there wasn't a street that was Chinatown or a corner or area.
Oregon Street came closest to it, particularly South Oregon. But generally, the Chinese lived where they worked. They would work someplace and then sleep in a back room at night. There wasn't many Chinese women, so there was a problem with getting wives. But they were a fascinating people and added a lot of color and brilliance to our society.
And we also had some other areas that were early precursors of modern-day El Paso, the area around the McGoffin home, McGoffinsville at one time, that district that formed around there as well. So there's a lot of different sections of the El Paso area.
Yes, after the 1880s, the town began expanding down around where the McGoffin home is now. And it also began expanding up what we now call the Sunset Heights area. Sunset Heights is generally considered to be El Paso's first residential area when we moved out of the downtown area, and that was
almost kind of a suburb of the city.
Right, except, but they built all, you go up there today and you see that fascinating architecture. And you don't really give much thought because there's so much architecture there today you can't see anything. But when you went up there in 1881, you had a view that was magnificent. And it's called Sunset Heights because that was the last place in El Paso that you could watch the sunset. And it was magnificent going down.
Now, you mentioned Concordia. We think of Concordia as cemetery, but Concordia was a settlement at one time as well. Right?
Concordia was a settlement. That's one of the things I was never able to precisely define. I know it had to be somewhere around Concordia Cemetery, but where did Stevenson, who established Concordia, incidentally, Stevenson grew up in a little town called Concordia, Missouri. And that's where you get the name, Concordia there. He brought the name with him. So where was his ranch? I don't know. It had to be somewhere around Concordia Cemetery. And the census of the 1860s shows 300 and some people living there. And I'm saying now, well, if that many people are living there, then where were they? And I don't know. Somewhere in that area, but I don't know.
One area that we think of often as kind of separate from El Paso, but it's actually a very important part of the development of the city, is Fort Bliss. And there were several Fort Blisses, I understand.
Fort Bliss started downtown in 1849. Then it was called the Post opposite El Paso, meaning El Paso across the river, what we today call Juarez. And Juarez is the oldest town around here. It began in 1659 and was over there, and El Paso doesn't start until about 1827. But anyhow, Fort Bliss began in 1849, called the Post opposite El Paso. It's just infantry. 1851, it's abolished. 1853, it came back to El Paso and was out at what they called McGoffinsville, to corner McGoffin and Willow Street. And still infantry. 1867, the river washed it away, and so it moved over to Concordia, near Concordia Cemetery, and became Camp Concordia. 1878, it moved back downtown, and the troops are drilling on El Paso Street, still infantry. 1881, they move out to where the Hacienda Cafe is, what was known as Hart's Mill, and still is to a large extent, and 2 of the old officers' quarters are still there. In 1893, then, it moved out on the Mesa, its 6th and presumably final location, and it was still infantry. Oddly, when it's there at Hart's Mill, the government wants to move Fort Bliss up to what's now Fort Selden, about 5 miles from Las Cruces. And El Pasoans about had a fit, and they said, look, if you'll keep Fort Bliss here, we'll buy some land for you. And the government says, we're going to need 1,000 acres. And El Pasoans said, we can raise that. And they did, boy. They kicked in their bucks, and they bought 1,000 acres out there on the Mesa. And then the government says, well, we've been thinking about it. We need 200 acres more. So El Pasoans said, well, all right. So they raised the money, and they bought 2 more 100 acres. Then they had that. And then the government says, well, how do we know we can't get any water out there? So the El Pasoans drilled, and they got excellent water. And then the government says, well, wait a minute. We've got that Mesa along the edge, and we don't own that, about 40 acres there. And if we don't own that, there's going to be saloons and brothels going there, and we can't have that. So this about sent El Pasoans into cardiac arrest. There's some hostile letters moving back and forth. But they came up with the money, and they bought that 40 acres, and the government was satisfied. And that 40 acres where the government was worried about saloons and brothels being, that's where Officers Row is today. That's where the Officers Club sits, right on the edge of the Mesa there.
And then at several points during the 20th century, Fort Bliss enlarges quite quickly, right?
Actually, Fort Bliss, I think we'd have lost Fort Bliss if it hadn't been for the Mexican Revolution. Fort Bliss was out on the Mesa. It was 5 miles from town. Sure. Probably wasn't 50 soldiers there. With the Mexican Revolution, however, 1910, 1920, you get Fort Bliss suddenly becomes the largest cavalry post. And it's never been cavalry. It's always been infantry. Suddenly it's the largest cavalry post in the United States. And because of that, then it goes on to become the largest artillery post in the United States. Then it becomes the largest air defense center in the world. And today we still have it. And we're very lucky to have it.
And the book also talks about some of the more natural features of the area. Some of them have been modified to some extent. You talk about the Franklin Mountains, El Paso Canyon. What do we mean by El Paso Canyon?
Good question. It drove the publisher. It drove the publisher nuts also. The geologists, you know where the trestles are in the valley there alongside the river. You know where Asarco is, you know Doniphan, or maybe it's Paisano, one or the other, comes winding down through there into El Paso alongside the river. Underneath the trestles, alongside Asarco, that is what geologists refer to as El Paso Canyon, and I like the name. And so in the book, I talk about El Paso Canyon. I give a title to this thing, which includes Mount Cristo Rey, which is actually in New Mexico. But I talked about the smelter. I talked about the railroads. I talked about the trestles. I talked about that practically underneath those trestles, you've got International Boundary Marker number 1. 2 parks there, one for the United States and one for Mexico. And it's a magnificent boundary marker, and 99% of all El Pasoans have never been there, haven't the vaguest idea that it is there. And so El Paso Canyon would have also included the smelter, would have included Smelter Town, and the hacienda and development through Hart's Mill and so on.
And that's been modified a little bit over the years. Definitely. I mean, that's been filled and graded, and it looks quite a bit different from what it did 100 years ago.
The whole town looks different than what it did 100 years ago.
And he also spent some time talking about Hueco tanks and the Franklin Mountains and a number of other natural features. The book is very nicely illustrated. There's maps that guide you around, and there's a man named Frederick Carter that helped you out with that. You've worked with Mr. Carter before?
Frederick Carter did the front cover painting, and magnificent painting. Couldn't have chosen a better painting than that one.
What is next? What projects are you working at this point?
I'm starting to research the Mexican Revolution, and I'm going to research it from the perspective of El Paso and Juarez, because as far as I am concerned, the core of if you understand what happened here at El Paso and Juarez regarding the Mexican Revolution, you understand everything. Sure. Or practically everything. For instance, let me give you some for instances here. Ciudad Juarez changed hands 6 different times during the Mexican Revolution, making it one of the most fought-over cities in North America. If it hadn't have been for El Paso and Juarez, there might not have been a Mexican Revolution. The reason being that these were 2 border towns. Juarez, let me come to El Paso first. El Paso was the largest town on the American border, and we not only had a railroad, no other American town had a railroad. And El Paso not only had a railroad, we had 5 of them coming in. And Juarez, being across the river, was the only town on the Mexican side of the border with a railroad connecting it to the capital. So through El Paso flowed not so much the manpower, but the munitions, the money, to manpower to a certain extent. Everything it takes to fight a revolution came through El Paso, and whoever controlled Juarez controlled that money and manpower and munitions. So you had all the great figures here. You had Pancho Villa, you had Victoriano Huerta, who died here in El Paso, former president of Mexico, buried in Evergreen Cemetery. You've got Fort Bliss, of course, becomes the big army post because of the Mexican Revolution. So if you can understand what happened here at El Paso and Juarez, you can understand the Mexican Revolution. And that's what I hope to do, is pull it together and make it make sense. Sure. We'll see.
Well, there's certainly a wide range of material available on that period, and a lot of people living in El Paso can trace their ancestry back to that period as well, definitely. So there's a lot of information available. We look forward to that work, and we certainly look forward to some of your future studies. And we want to mention once again, El Paso, Guided Through Time. This is the new guidebook by Mr. Leon Metz. And we want to thank you, Leon, for joining us here today on Along the Rio Grande. And we want to thank all of you as well, and we hope to see you on our next program.